Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of Monday Morning Musing. This is Steve Crosby. We are continuing on our way through Matthew 18. Now we're coming to 18:18, and I can't think of a verse where more hay has been made from a little bit of Bible than this verse right here. Whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. The whole topic of binding and loosing. Now, I could do probably 4 sessions on this alone, and I'm not going to. I may have to break it up into 2. But there has been so much nonsense based on so little, poorly exegeted and poorly applied, that we're going to talk about it today. First of all, there are only 4 passages in the Gospels that speak of binding or binding and loosing. And only 2 of the 4 speak of binding and loosing together. There's 4 passages that speak of binding, like binding the strong man. We're not going to get into that today. But the binding and loosing, there's only 2 passages, and both of them happen to be here in Matthew. Now, if I said to you, well, she kicked the bucket. Does that literally mean that somebody went out and kicked a bucket? Of course not. In our culture, it's a metaphor for somebody who's passed away, who's died. Binding and loosing was a well-known Semitic Hebrew figure of speech. And it's a figure of speech that particularly the Pharisees, the rabbis, took unto themselves as the authority to retain or remit sins. I don't have time to take a deep dive on that, other than to say you can't take this literally, and you sure can't bring in fallen angels and principalities and powers and binding and loosing demons. Here's a question. We're talking about context. From verse 1 to right now, where does this chapter say anything about invisible spiritual powers? You know, we gotta bind the prince of Persia, and we have to bind this and bind that, and loose the spirit of rejoicing and bind the spirit of depression. Where in this passage is that? It's not there. Now, if you want to talk about binding the strong man in the sense of some deliverance issues, we could talk about that on another day, but we're not talking about that. What's the context of this passage? Conflict resolution in the community. There's no spiritual warfare application, reference, interpretation with this passage at all. None. Zero. Can't do it. Not legitimate. Not justified. There are entire ministries and conferences and books and seminars and teachings about how to identify the prevailing principality and bind the principality, because whatever we bind on earth is bound in heaven. That's not what this passage is about. That's not what 18 is saying. It's a metaphor for the authority that the community has as it adjudicates relational conflict. It's so important, and we're going to see it in the next verse, in the next episode. It's about the issue of peacemaking. And Jesus is saying that this issue is so important that whatever the community addresses this, whenever the community is working at peacemaking, whenever the community, the whole community, the voice of the collective community is gathered together, particularly his ecclesia, his gathering. And this is why also this passage would have been very offensive to the rabbis and the Pharisees, because they believed they had that power. And we know from other stories that the offense of Jesus saying your sins are forgiven is one of the things that got him crucified. Well, that privilege and right and authority also resides in the community when it comes to resolving interpersonal conflicts. Yeah, we get to participate with him in peacemaking. And whatever the community decides on earth, there's a representative, an echo, as it were. It's as if heaven is present on earth, agreeing with what the community is working out. It is totally illegitimate to turn this into a spiritual warfare passage. This is talking about Christ's delegated authority to the community, not just the leadership team. Now again, some circumstances, the leadership team as representatives of the community might be legitimate, but that's not the default. This is about the resident ability of the community to self-govern and to bring shalom to itself. Peace, wholeness, wellness, salvation, all the goodness of God. So that's all I'm going to say on this episode, because it kind of spills over into the next verse. For me, the next verse is like the ribbon on this package that wraps it all up. And I'll see you the next time.